Director of the New York City Veterans Alliance, which is a grassroots policy advocacy and empowerment organization. We are committed to advancing veterans and family members as civic leaders. We are also the only organization that is actively dedicated to policy advocacy here in New York City. Some of you were here on Monday where we celebrated and gave an information session about a law we just got passed in New York City. It was passed unanimously. Thank you. It was passed unanimously last June. It's going into effect next month. It is going to be the strongest local level protection for veterans and military members in the country. And so we are really proud of that, and that's the kind of work we do, and it's the kind of work that we involve veterans and family members directly in. And we are also operating a website called ourveterans.nyc as a community information hub. You can find out what's happening in the New York City Veterans community at ourveterans.nyc. That's a free service we provide to our community. And we also are training veterans and spouses on how to run for office. And so we are empowering our community with better information, with easily accessible information. We are involving them in making change here in New York City, and we are training them to make even more change. By hopefully the next election cycle, we will get them elected to local office here. Yeah. I want to say thank you to Civic Hall for asking us to co-sponsor this event tonight. I also happen to be an organizer in residence here at Civic Hall, which is a training program that lets people like me and Olivia, our Director of Operations, get better at organizing and making change for regular people and getting citizens more involved in what's happening in our democracy. And so Civic Hall asked us to host this event that is a discussion by veterans and inviting many veterans into the room to discuss the landmark documentary series produced by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick called The Vietnam War. Many of you have had an opportunity to watch the many episodes and the many hours of documentary footage here that we're going to talk about tonight. And it's really profound, and I know that as a veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan, I always knew during my years of service in Afghanistan that we had many similarities to Vietnam, and different tactics and political moments that were very similar to Vietnam. I didn't realize how similar until I started watching the series. I even have said at some point that watching the series, it feels like I'm watching Afghanistan but with more trees. There's a lot of striking similarities that will definitely come out in this conversation. I want to say some thank yous in getting started here. I also want to thank Pathfinder for donating our food this evening. We're a scrappy nonprofit on a budget, so we really appreciate when folks can sponsor stuff. Pathfinder.vet is a platform to review veterans services and resources and organizations, not just in New York City but nationally. So if you go to pathfinder.vet, you can write a review right now, even if you wanted to, of the New York City Veterans Alliance, of Pathfinder, of organizations that you belong to, that you're otherwise affiliated with, because reviewing is part of knowing if an organization or a resource is the right fit for you. Elana, Duffy, who is the CEO and founder of Pathfinder, she'll be glad to fill you in more on Pathfinder, and also some of her cards are on the table here next to the food. And so thank you, Elana and Pathfinder, for providing some food this evening. Also, I want to say thank you to our members. We are an organization that we're just over 2 years old. And early on, a lot of folks in this room signed on as members because they believed in what we could do. And we wouldn't be anywhere without our members and their early support and their ongoing support. We were able to, like I mentioned, pass Local Law 119, which is going to make a huge difference for veterans and their families here in New York City. That wouldn't have been possible without members buying in early on and really having faith in what we were doing. And as a result of the good work that we've been able to do, we just received a donation from Craig Newmark in the amount of $50,000, which is a sizable donation for a young organization like us. And we are running a matching campaign where we are inviting 50 donors to donate any amount between $1,000 and $5,000 to be part of our 50 Bricks campaign, which is a virtual capital campaign to really strengthen the foundation of our organization, to get big and to do even more for veterans and families in New York City. And so, again, thank you to our members and to our donors and to Craig Newmark and to Civic Hall and everybody who makes this possible. I also want to ask you, as audience members, as veterans, as civilians, as citizens, as people who are participating in the moment in history we're at right now, and also looking back on the history of 50 years ago, to remember that our panelists here have come up and they have been willing to offer their own lived experiences, which are complex and difficult, and often difficult to remember and difficult to think about and even to talk about. And so I want to make sure that we together create a space where we can have very different viewpoints and we can have different opinions and closely held beliefs, but still have a place of, come at this as a place of respect. So we want to spend a good amount of time with audience questions, but I ask that all of us please remember that we're talking about people's lives and many, closely held beliefs and the burden of history, whether it's our recent wars or our long ago wars. And so I ask that we just remember that as we're discussing very important and complex issues, because this panel is going to deal with some of the complexity. I also want to invite you to continue the conversation, if you would like to, with us afterward when this ends at Peter McManus Cafe, which is on 19th and 7th Avenue. I will be over there, and if you want to have a beer with me, and anybody else who wants to go, you're more than welcome. And so, without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. I am honored to have each one of you here. And I'm going to read bios because I want to do justice to the life and career of the folks you see on the stage here. First, I want to introduce Phil Milio. Phil volunteered to serve in the United States Army from 1967 to 1970. He volunteered for deployment to Vietnam, arriving in October 1968, serving 1 year as a photographic laboratory technician in the 1st Military Intelligence Battalion, Air Reconnaissance Support, stationed at Arvan 3rd Corps, headquarters in Bien Hoa. He has undergraduate degrees in photography from SUNY and a master's from NYU in higher ed administration. He retired as a professor and counselor after 40 years at FIT. His writing has been published in 3 editions of Afterwards in 2015, 2016, and 2017, an anthology of the Fordham University Veterans Writing Workshop, and in Stars and Stripes online edition, and his photographic art has been exhibited at the Ellenville Museum in Ulster County, New York. Phil is newly involved in New York City theater, including with Bedlam Outreach, a theatrical reading of his memoirs and poems, Aquila Theater, in the Warrior Chorus of Philoctetes, and Public Works, community ensemble of As You Like It. He served as a military technical advisor in Militurgy for a StoryCorps animation called Tom's War. The Sheen Center, 9 Circles, the New York Historical Society's current exhibition, The Vietnam Experience, and the Little Spoon, Big Spoon production of A Piece of My Heart. Next, I'd like to introduce Tom Mooney. Tom Mooney has been in advertising for over 30 years and is currently president of ADD Digital. He has won virtually every industry award, including Cannes Lions, Clio's, Andes, Addies, AICP Production Excellence, an Emmy, and a Peabody. Tom has guided the careers of many distinguished directors, including 4 Directors Guild of America nominees and 1 winner for Best TV Commercial Director. Since its inception in 2009, AD Digital has produced projects for Ace Hardware, ESPN, Nickelodeon, Porsche, the Sundance Channel, Sotheby's, and USGA, among many other distinguished clients. The company has also produced award-winning short films and web series, including a film on veterans for the 2012 Democratic National Convention. Before forming AD Digital, Tom was a founder and owner of one of the top commercial production companies in the world, Headquarter Films, over which he presided for 16 years. Prior to that, he was the director of marketing for global production companies, Spots Films, Bianchi Films, and Lufaro & Associates. A native New Yorker, Tom spent almost 20 years in the music business before entering the advertising arena. He was a drummer and lead singer in several New York City-based bands, including the New York City August Rock Band and the Yorkville Saints, and he also did a stint on the road with the Ohio Express.
Don't ask.
Tom holds a BFA in theater from Hunter College, where he studied with Lloyd Richards and Harold Kluwerman. He wrote and appeared in Tent 6 at the St. Clements Theater and continues to write in his spare time. Tom is a Vietnam veteran, the father of 2 great children, and resides in Manhattan with his wife. Mr. Herbert Sweat is a genuine hero of the Vietnam War and is former president of the board of Black Veterans for Social Justice. He served in the United States Army from April 1966 to October 1970. He earned honors and medals for his gallantry, bravery, and commitment. Mr. Sweat was born and raised in Bedford-Stuyvesant. He attended PS 35, Franklin K. Lane High School, and New York Technical College. He's been married for 14 years, as of this bio. Is it longer? Yes. It is longer. And he has 8 children and 23 grandchildren. Is that current? Mr. Sweat came to Black Veterans for Social Justice after over 20 years ago, homeless and seeking services, and he bonded with the organization. He participated in veteran discussion groups with other homeless veterans who were experiencing a familiar service-related problem: mental illness, unemployment, undiagnosed disability, and poor social reintegration back into society and family life. The Veterans Action was formed out of these sessions. Over the years, he transformed from being a client in need to a provider of help and support. Mr. Sweat helps veterans with employment opportunities, medical issues, compensation problems with the Veterans Administration, and a myriad of other concerns that they encountered. He organized and provides leadership to the organization body and helps our Veterans Action Group become one of the most powerful veterans self-help groups in New York City. His work has been recognized by various community service organizations, the New York Press, and the Mayor of New York City. In 2013, Mr. Sweat was featured in Philip Napoli's book, Bringing It All Back Home, an oral history of New York City's Vietnam veterans. And we're pleased to have Philip in the room with us tonight. So thank you for being here. Mr. Herbert Sweat continues to provide exemplary service to the entire veteran community. Thank you for being with us. So for our younger panelists, we do not have bios as long.
Make it up.
So Elana Duffy, who is CEO and co-founder of Pathfinder Labs, Pathfinder.vet. She graduated from Cornell University with a Master's of Engineering in 2002, then quit her job to enlist in the United States Army from 2003 to 2012. She was medically retired with a Purple Heart following combat tours in OEF and OIF, that's Afghanistan and Iraq for the rest of us, eventually returning home to New York City to found Pathfinder Labs. Thank you for being here. Pham is a Vietnamese-American veteran of the war in Afghanistan and a Brooklyn-based writer. His works on the fiction editorial staff. He works on the fiction editorial staffs of the Brooklyn Review and the Rathbearing Tree. He has bylines in the Daily Beast, Foreign Policy, Literary Hub, Consequence Magazine, and others. Thank you for being with us. And also, everyone, it is Drew's 30th birthday, and he chose to spend it with us.
I got shoes out.
My favorite in the room, actually.
And then our moderator tonight is Whitney Kassel, the one civilian you see on stage with us, but a veteran like us in many ways. Whitney Kassel is a freelance consultant and columnist for Foreign Policy. She worked from 2015 to 2017 at Palantir Technologies, where she focused on engagement with government clients. Prior to Palantir, she spent 4 years at the Arkin Group, where she oversaw due diligence and strategic risk analysis in South Asia, the Middle East, and the former Soviet Union. Ms. Kassel previously served 5 years in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where she specialized in Pakistan policy, special operations, and counterterrorism. Ms. Kassel served 1 year in Pakistan with the Office of the Defense Representative and Special Operations Command Central, and 2 months in Afghanistan on General Stanley McChrystal's Strategic Assessment Team. She has also worked at the Council on Foreign Relations, the Atlantic, and the Polish-Ukrainian Cooperation Foundation in Kiev, Ukraine. She has a BA from Barnard College and an MA from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So thank you for I will let Whitney take it from here. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Kristen. I am honored to be here and to have the opportunity to moderate this awesome panel that brings a lot of diversity, a lot of experience to the table here. I would imagine that our audience does as well. I think it might be helpful for the panelists to get a sense of who's in the room here. So if by a show of hands we could just see who the veterans in the room are. Spouses, children of veterans, military families. Civilians who served in conflict, or folks who are studying the war, just interested. I assume that's the rest of the room, but yeah, okay, great. That's helpful, yeah, as I suspected, many people with a lot of experience in this. So just to dive right in, I assume a good number of you have watched at least some of the documentary. It is rather lengthy, so I know it's a slog for all of us to watch such heavy material for so many hours, but it brings the war into pretty sharp relief, and it's a pretty intense experience just watching the footage even 40 years later, and hearing the experiences of the people who were there on all sides, and hearing the experiences of the civilians who lived through these wars, and the folks who served. The scale of the Vietnam War, for me and for those of us who weren't born, is just shocking. 2.5 million U.S. military service members served in Vietnam. 59,000 U.S. service members were killed in Vietnam, and an estimated 1 million civilians were killed in this conflict. So looking at Iraq, Afghanistan, the wars that we read about today, they're just dwarfed by what this conflict looked like. That said, we are still a nation at war, and it's very important for us to keep this history fresh as we navigate, the conflicts that our country is in now, the conflicts that we may get into in the future. So I think the timing of this documentary and this panel is really auspicious and important, and so I'm glad that we're all here to talk about it. The fundamental questions in some ways that our country faced in Vietnam are the same, as the ones that our government and our country are facing in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's so much. It was a challenge to sort of dive into the material that this documentary brings up, and so I think we're going to start with a clip. But just before we run it, the first thing that really jumped out at me, and what this clip talks to, is sort of the similarities, and sort of Kristen was referencing, for those of us who were involved in the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq, watching this documentary and just seeing just how many things were, if not the same, then strong echoes on both sides. So we could just watch that real quick.
The overall myth of an American army running roughshod by policy, by strategy, by tactics to terrorize and murder and victimize the innocent population of South Vietnam. That image is it doesn't do justice to the young men and women who served over there. It's certainly not an accurate depiction of what our army was about.
From the first, the Johnson administration understood that the war could not be won without convincing poor farmers living in the countryside that the government in Saigon, not the Viet Cong, had their best interests at heart. In addition to the military, many American aid organizations were at work in Vietnamese villages. They dug wells and built windmills, started schools, introduced improved rice, provided medical care, and electrified much of the countryside. Under pressure from Robert McNamara, MacV struggled to find ways to measure the progress of pacification in South Vietnam's 44 provinces, 220 districts, and 13,000 hamlets, and finally came up with the Hamlet Evaluation System. Soon, some 220 U.S. district advisors were required to produce some 90,000 pages of data every month, a mountain of information so daunting, no one could make sense of it.
All right. So aside from the echoes of hideous metrics exercises, which unfortunately still exist, at least in my experience in our armed forces, the idea of bringing development and sort of protecting the population and trying to build wells, electrify the country, you know, this sort of soft side of counterinsurgency was really similar, I think, to a lot of the things that we at least tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the first thing I wanted to ask our panel about, and I don't, you know, none of these questions are directed at anyone in particular, so feel free to jump in, but just to talk a little bit about that dichotomy between the efforts in both wars to sort of win hearts and minds and to bring the people over to the side of the government, and the realities of combat and conflict and war, and kind of why we actually fight wars and the sort of harder side, and how those two, what the interplay was for you on the ground in both conflicts, and whether you thought it even made sense to do sort of these softer things and if they worked.
So I will, speaking at least as military intelligence, I did ground military intelligence for most of my career, and we worked very closely with the well diggers, the civil affairs folks, the people that were out there making a lot of the progress, trying to build roads and help the civilian population, because we were actually out there to help. We were out there to make allies, to make the world a better place by making sure that they understood, hey, the bombs in the road, they're blowing up your people too. They're causing problems for your folks too. So the more we can work together, the safer everybody is. And so that there's a huge element of that is still going on, that does go on, and there is also, I think, a main disconnect. And I actually think that it was funny that I think Bill said it in the email chain that we were having before this panel, where it was like, that was way above my pay grade. And I mean, as far as like military intelligence went, that was everybody knew, like, we need to make sure that this message is out. But dealing with the infantry, I mean, like, they were like, no, we have to be out there. This is our mission. This is straight up what we're doing. This is what needs to happen. Like, we're out there today to run a checkpoint. We're only out here to find this, to do this, to do X, Y, and Z. But, and I don't think the basic strategic mission, I don't think that that strategic mission I don't think that that coin or a counterterrorism mission gets down far enough, and so that's why you get that impression that war is war, and even in the video, I don't even know if I'm making sense right now, that the that wartime impression of everybody is out here just to fight, and war is the stacking of bodies essentially is all that it is, because that strategic mission only gets to a select few, either a select few jobs or a select few in the higher ranks of say infantry, or in his case,
I
yeah, you know.
no, you're making a great point. I just, do I need a mic? I talk pretty fucking loud. Do I need a mic?
I need a mic.
I agree with you about the wars today. It's too many of them we can't remember. But in Vietnam, it was above my pay grade. I was a draftee, which makes me another part of the documentary I want to talk about later. When you're on the ground and you're in a helicopter company or an infantry company, you don't know that's going on. And the problem with Vietnam, the liars were telling everybody here how many people we were killing compared to how many were dying. They weren't telling us, the news was not talking about it, neither was our government. And anybody else my age will remember this. They were telling how many were killed in combat in a mission compared to how many Americans we lost. To the point where McNamara got into this whole game where if we killed 250,000 people of the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong, something that the film was great about. We three know, we weren't just fighting Viet Cong, we were fighting an army from Hanoi, in khakis, in fatigues, a trained army. We were fighting in the middle of a civil war. So they thought of us as invaders. Both sides, the South and North, didn't want us there. They just got rid of the French. And there we were with tanks, helicopters, Cobras, machine guns. We had it all. So we had no idea about this stuff going on to help the civilians. We employed civilians on the base. But during the Tet Offensive, those same civilians had maps of our base. And I'm not blaming them. It's their country. The lying that went on is insane. And unfortunately today, it's continuing. And I just don't get it. I really don't. They had commanders lying. Lieutenants would say, 12 of us died, we can't find any bodies. Because sometimes the North Vietnamese, the VC, would take them away quickly, which we would do too. And they would make them say, as it shows in the documentary, no, say 75, you killed 75. They were making up numbers to say we were winning the war, when we weren't winning the war. So to rebuild a country, first you have to decide what the fuck you want to do here. You want to conquer it? Do you want to help them? We messed it up. We did, and I'm not proud. But the thought, when I came home, I thought, maybe I did this, even though I was drafted, I didn't volunteer, so we would never have another stupid fucking war. And that made me stand a little taller, okay? I was wrong. Dead fucking wrong. I'm sorry.
So, you know, I grew up with this, right? It shocks me sometimes when Americans are like, "Oh my God, I didn't know how crazy it was," because this is unfolding in my living room when I was a kid. My mother is from the north. She lived in Pham. And my dad is the son of an Arvin colonel. And so, I mean, all of these dynamics played out. I learned all of this growing up. And, you know, the fighting happened again growing up because my parents hated each other. That being said, I joined the U.S. Army anyway, for some reason. But, you know, all of the stuff that came up, and I learned a few things, but I really didn't learn that much with the Ken Burns documentary, because I'd grown up learning it, I took an interest in it, and when I was deployed to Afghanistan, the linchpin of our strategy, and I was a scout platoon leader, so I was pretty low down there, combat arms, reconnaissance troops. And I thought, well, maybe I can take this counterinsurgency strategy and do better. Like maybe I can prevent another, like Tom is saying, prevent another shitty war. Unfortunately, that's not how it works, especially when it comes to trying to build a country at the muzzle of a rifle. You don't do that. We built schools, we did projects, we helped a girls' school and put windows into their buildings so that they could operate over the winter. And then the fighting season started and it all went to pot. All it took was one dead civilian. Our snipers accidentally killed a teacher in a nearby village, and that, all of the work, all of the money, all the treasure, all that training, it went to shit because, and this is the greatest analogy I've ever heard, so, but it's not mine. You know, once the shooting starts, it's like asking a football team if they want to go and play ball. Of course, the answer is yes. We want to fight because that's part of our organizational DNA, and so that's what we did. We fought, and I can honestly say, despite my upbringing, despite my education, despite the good intentions of a strategy that was put together by our best and brightest, we still failed, I think. We still failed.
You don't have to answer every question, so just whatever you want to. But you certainly can.
To kill was one of my most profound thoughts. Was one of the training techniques that I learned here while I went through training to do just that. It wasn't to build a road, to educate anyone, to even think for myself. I was taught to kill. And this 7-day movie that always seems to be shown from a Hollywood's mindset. Where they're playing with the kids. You know, we didn't play with them. We did just what you spit on us on. And we did just like you heard when Lieutenant Calley was the fall guy. So I'm going to speak to you tonight the best I can with the effects and the truth of what I was called a boonie rat, a baby killer, as well as anything that we saw when we came into a village. In the fields, if one of us died or was wounded, it would be the major plan to go and destroy the closest village. I want you to pay strict attention to the unit that I was with. They showed it on that screen. It was the first soldier that you saw taking care or giving something to the children. He had a herdsman patch on, 173rd Airborne Brigade. We were what they call Westmoreland Strike Unit. And he used us to do just that. To get in those helicopters at his command and go to any area that was what we call red hot. I was only 18 years old. I wasn't highly intelligent. I was just taught how to kill very well. And I thought that was my job. And when I got to Vietnam, that's where I got my jungle training at. They didn't train me in the United States for jungle school or how to deal with the booby traps, punji states, or just really that there were kids running around or women running around. So when I got there, I got my first jungle training. And that's where I started realizing and being afraid that I wasn't going to come home. Right here to New York, to face all of you guys. A lot of y'all wasn't there, but believe me, your parents were there. And they called it what it was. Because I came home in 1968 after the tech offense. And during the war, like what you just saw in the opening of the film, you're going to see one of my soldiers, one of my comrades that's wearing my patch. And I never really seen that part. I was always, as I told you, in the boonies. I never very seldom came to an area where it was calm like that. I never seen them truly enjoying that life, except for when I went on an in-country R&R, which was only for a day. I suppose it gotten 3 days, and they flew me in, but they wanted to take my weapons away. And I wouldn't give it to them, so they sent me back to the field. I was comfortable with that. I heard a few of my comrades here speak of the situation that they were in. Well, the Boonie Rats are just what the name calls for. We lived in the fields. We dug holes every night. We chopped down bamboo or anything we can get wood-wise to put a cover over us. And we pulled 2-hour shifts. During that time was my scariest time at all times because nighttime scares me. Reminds me of death because that's when you fall asleep and you do wild dreams or you don't have the physical control of oneself when you sleep at night. So I'm trying to express to you what a boonie rat feels. Was I wrong? Of course I was wrong at this stage in my life. I should have never went to the war. But then I went as a 17-year-old that, as he said, enlisted. Why? Because my family were warriors. they went into the service to work, not only to serve, but to work, to become equal to our fellow man here back in the United States. We went into the service so that we could be looked upon as proud people, being that I am part Native American and part my mother from Augusta, Georgia, being a black American. And it's been very difficult to understand our foresight in trying to be equal here in this country, to be loved and respected. So when I got there to the war and saw what war truly was, it enhanced my love for humanity. But yet, the opposite side, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, the follower of a young man, I did what my comrade would do. If he was hurt, I was hurt. If he got killed, I would kill. And this is the way the herd, the 173rd Airborne, worked. We were only a brigade. That means we have 5 battalions. And Westmoreland used us for operations to do just that. So my understanding was that's what we were here to do. They didn't show us anything that I just saw on that first cover. When I came in at Benoit, they were bombing the airstrip. When I left Benoit to go up north a little bit to a place called Ankh, where the cavalry was, the first cav, they were air mobile. So why are we leaving Benoit? Benoit is pretty nice. Had a big airstrip, we could see the birds coming in. I'm gonna get on that one day. But when we got up there to Ankh, the first cav was called air mobile, helicopters. And what you learn is that helicopters was truly our fighting mechanism over there. And that's what Westmoreland put us on, to go out and make strikes that were deadly. Strikes that where other people were in trouble. No, we didn't worry about anything. So I want your mindset as this picture goes on and we discuss this. What was this killing all about? They call Vietnam the killing fields. Ask yourselves as we go through this, well, aren't they all? Recently, Afghanistan, Iraq, we watched the bombs come down. Do you think it's not killing babies, ladies, old men? It's killing everyone. Everywhere we go as Americans, into these other countries, we're killing. Is it truly for freedom? Do you really understand what freedom is? With this, I'm going to leave you with watching and asking. I already told you, no, I was wrong. And I've been asking the higher power, and I've been asking you to forgive me for this. I don't know what to say to this female that was in war, was hurt. But what I can tell you, they didn't give her no respect in this film. And I want you to observe it. When I went to the 90th Evacuation Hospital in a place called Tuiwa, it's over there by the China Sea, the women were there, the nurses. They were there. They took care of me. When we went we didn't get a chance to go to these shows that you see, the shows that the ladies come over and they go up on the stage. Bob Hope Show. That's right, Mr. Mooney.
I was there.
Yeah, Bob Hope Show. They offered us the Bob Hope Show when we came down off of Hill 875 that you're going to see. When we came down off that hill, they said the herdsmen are going to see the Bob Hope Show for Christmas. That Christmas, we served the third perimeter out from the show. Perimeters go around the show. We were on the third one out. So we didn't see Bob Hope. We didn't see the girls get off the plane. So don't misunderstand when you hear people explain to you that they did this or they did that. They did what they were told. I did what I was told. And I told you the truth of what I was told. They took, when they killed one of us in an ambush or something, they would take different parts of our bodies, mutilated us. They used to, that's how we did the same thing. We would take a finger, take an ear, put it in some alcohol, and wear it as a memento. So I'm gonna let the next veteran go, which he might have understood a little bit of what I've done too. He might have been a boonie rat too. Boonie rat. A boonie rat.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's important. Oops. Am I on now? Just taking away, and I didn't mean to overstate the similarities. I think it's worth just drawing from that the significant differences as well in kind of how we fought and also how different units fought. That there were folks maybe handing out rights and also folks who were killing people. So that's part of the complexity here. I wanted to move on a little bit to the U.S. political side of this and talk about the draft and what it means to have a military that was primarily drafted or at least a significant portion was drafted in Vietnam and having an all-volunteer force today, and what that means for civil-military relations. We're seeing the kind of the primacy of the military right now in Washington, and sort of the big role that General Mattis, General Kelly are playing, and I think a lot of that is caught up in sort of the lionization of an all-volunteer force, and the way that veterans and soldiers are treated in the United States today versus how they were treated during Vietnam, after Vietnam as a draftee force, and what that means for sort of the way that we fought and fight now. Yep, we're going to have an audience question segment just a little bit later.
So you want to go? Can I talk as the draftee?
Right. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. As Kristen said earlier, I enlisted. In the era of Vietnam, we were still under the laws of conscription, and so it was something of a ritual at some point that a young man would, by the age of 18, have to register for the selective service. And then at some point, they may be called in on active duty. Now, this was during, of course, we're in a wartime in Vietnam, and so that would be an issue for those who were over 18. But when I was 17, I graduated high school, and my brother was already in the Air Force. And I admired my brother, and I followed his footsteps. I thought, well, maybe I'll join, and my parents wouldn't sign. They'd have to sign if you're 17. 18, you can sign up on your own. And as I got closer to the age of 18, I told them I was going to go in when I turn 18, but if I go in, and they signed for me, and this was just a few months before my 18th birthday, I would get promised a school, which is what happened, and that's what I did. So the way I grew up with my friends in my neighborhood and their fathers served in World War II or Korea, it was something that we expected as males that we would eventually get called unless somehow we received a deferment. And the video talks about deferments and different types, and sometimes you hear about that in the news even now. That took place in that era. So that cloud, if you want to call it that, was always hanging over our heads. So I didn't know any better than that, and I decided I wanted to join so I'd also have an opportunity for a career. So I was seriously thinking, well, maybe the military might be a place where I hadn't been to college, so I thought, well, that would be a good way to learn a career, and maybe I'd stay. You can retire after 20 years, all that stuff. So I joined, and I had just turned 18 by the time I went on active duty. So there's my initiation to the draft and how I dealt with it, which was to join on my own because I really didn't care. I wasn't going to wait until I was drafted. My brother waited until he was almost drafted and then joined the Air Force. And I thought that was running it a little bit too tight. And he had a great 4 years, a little more than 4 years in the Air Force, learning a technical skill and being able to be productive when he got out, use those skills. So I joined, and then when I did join and went on active duty and I went through training, I was actually initially sent to West Germany in a signal battalion, and I was there working with photography. And after a few months, I decided this is boring. We were on alert because there was an invasion by the Soviets in Eastern Europe, and that was kind of strange. In fact, it was a little scary, but for about a week or so, we were on high alert. And then I put in papers to transfer to Vietnam. So then I went to Vietnam. So I'm volunteering not only to be in the service, but to go to Vietnam. And when I got there, and when I reflect back on that video we saw of little kids, I learned very quickly not to trust them. No way was I going to trust them. And there were some tough moments with having to deal with the little kids in order to be able to survive, going from point A to point B in a Jeep or a truck. They can't be near you because they may be carrying some sort of explosive. Without getting graphic or whatever, I'll just tell you that I had learned that quickly, that my role is to survive and to help my brothers survive. So we would take turns riding shotgun. If two of us had to just go pick up the mail at a depot someplace, we would always have someone riding shotgun with us. And if a kid jumped up on the truck to sell us cigarettes, or his sister, we would get them off. We would get them off in sometimes a violent way, but we would get them off the truck. That's pretty tough to go home with, and it's pretty tough to adjust to somehow when you're 18, 19 years old. It becomes a part of a pattern you learn when you're still learning how to be an adult. So that's really serious, because then when you come home into what is considered civilized society, you have to shut that off somehow. So that's what that video of looking at those little kids immediately reminded me. I even felt it, like, these kids, what's going to happen here when I watched it. And then dealing with conscription, I didn't have to. And it was, actually, when I turned 18, I went in and got my selective service card. It's 1A, and I was really proud of that. I said, I could use this, put it in my pocket. I didn't need it anymore because I had an Army ID card. So growing up in that era, the military would be something that a male would have to deal with one way or another.
I was a drummer in the rock and roll band and didn't know what Vietnam was, never heard of it. I didn't believe in the newspapers. I didn't read them. I was in Brooklyn. I was happy. but I had to register for the draft, so I registered for the draft. It wasn't an anti-war movement, it was very small before I was drafted. I was drafted in October 1966, at the age of 19. The anti-war movement wasn't even there yet, so there wasn't this whole thing about the war going on. There was peripherally, but not. But the major anti-war movements happened while I was serving in Vietnam. I was drafted in October '66, and 1 year later, I was shipped to Vietnam. In October 10th, 1967, to be exact. I still wasn't sure what I was getting into. You know, I was a Brooklyn kid. I paid attention during basic training and all that because I realized I might be winding up in this place. And there I was. I arrived, and a funny situation is I flew across in a C-141, which is a gigantic plane you see in the movies, where they open up the back and the trucks come out. We're sitting like 30 across or something for 18 to 20 hours on a little seat like I sat on a helicopter, a canvas seat. We get there, they land, we stop in Japan, we refuel, we land in Benoit. We served similar time in similar areas, the three of us, which is pretty wild. So I remember, I'm a draftee and a drummer. I don't think the Army wanted me either, but they had to get, you can guess why, because I was in the music business, they put me in radios. It makes a lot of fucking sense. So, and I'm in radios and helicopters, which makes even less sense because I'm terrified of fucking fire. So, it's all going well. So just give you a moment, so we land in Benoit and they get out and the Air Force guys going, get out, get out, get out, get out. They lower the back, they shovel on our equipment, get the fuck out, go to the fence, go to the fence, go to the fence, go to the fence. We run to the fence, we run to the fence, and the plane turns around and takes off. Now that's not a good way to begin, okay? Because it's like, this sucks. Then I get on a bus, and the bus has cages on it, and the first thing some guy says, is this to keep us from getting out? And the driver, the corporal, says, no, this is to keep them from throwing grenades in you, dumb fuck. So that's the beginning. Now, I did not do what this gentleman did, but I did fly, my men flew this gentleman out. And what this gentleman went through, I saw in their faces every time we flew them back. And I forgive you. We forgive you. They did that to you. I was not in that situation. I was at a home base in the helicopter company. But we got hit, and we got hit a lot because they wanted to get those helicopters. But as far as the draft, it sucked. And one thing, and I was proud I served. And I served, and I'm still proud I served. I'm proud to serve with these men. But it destroyed my generation. There were those that went and those that didn't. Those that beat it, those that went. Those that died. Those that were in combat. Those that weren't in combat. Those that were stationed in Germany didn't go to Nam. Those that went to Nam. Those that got promoted. Those who did this. It divided my generation. We were the fucking Beatles. In 1967, Sergeant Pepper. That's the year I went to Vietnam. That makes no sense. It still doesn't. It caused bitterness between my generation. My generation, the draft, everyone should have to serve in some capacity their country.
Hoorah. Hoorah.
Hoorah. We are the only, we're so many nations, the French do, the Israelis do, we're one of the few countries that do not. I don't care if you work in a library at a base. I don't care if you clean streets. You've got to do something for your country if you want to live in this place. Because having been in Vietnam, I know how hard it is to be in war and be in someplace where you're not free. I saw it every fucking day. Yeah, I didn't see what he saw every day, but we got attacked, we got hit. I lost 4 of my friends, 4 men who did not raise children, who did not have the life I have. Never. So, yes, everyone should serve their country. I'm still angry and still bitter, and I think my generation is still bitter. We have men in power who beat the draft. It sickens me. It's not just you know who. There's a whole fucking bunch of them. Okay? A whole bunch of them. Am I still mad at them? No. I have more respect for some of the guys who ran to Canada, because at least they did something with their conviction. They just didn't hide under the rug. Okay? They can't come home. That's showbiz. I'm ranting. I wouldn't trade it. My son served in the Marine Corps in Afghanistan. That 9 months was much harder than my 11 months, 29 days, 7 hours, and 41 minutes in Vietnam. We should all serve. This woman is one of the less than 400 women who have won the Purple Heart in the United States military. Elana Duffy.
Actually, I don't even know if it's a win. Yeah, I don't know if I would call it a win. I mean, it's yeah. Enemy Marksmanship Award. Oh no! I can say that. I don't want to I would say, well, first of all, welcome home. First of all, to the three of you. But also just, I would say even, and I actually kind of commiserate with Phil up here. I was one of those people, and of course we didn't have to deal with the draft. I actually very much agree with Tom on. I strongly believe in a conscripted form of service, of serving your country in some fashion, of a fashion that serves you best, of saying, AmeriCorps, Teach for America, do something that gets you out of your comfort zone and that serves somebody else, that puts you out in your community, that puts you out in some other community of a disadvantaged population, that makes you feel uncomfortable and makes you realize that somebody out there can use help in some fashion, and it doesn't have to be military service. But anyway, that's like that's a whole different conversation. I actually do come from a military family, but my grandparents were both in during World War II. My father served during Vietnam, but never went to Vietnam. I always joke that he fiercely guarded the Potomac, and yes, in his defense, the North Vietnamese never did, in fact, cross the Potomac, so he did his job very well. But he was a volunteer, but they never talked about their time in service. It was not a part of their of daily conversation. It was not really any part of our lives like it was with Drew. And so when I was the first person in my family, including most of my extended family, to go to combat, it was a very peculiar part in my extended family. What is a Jewish girl from New Jersey doing a Cornell Master's of Engineering with a good job? How's my mom going to explain this to the rest of the synagogue type of conversation? But it was just something that I felt I needed to do. I needed to get out there. I needed to help. And then not only that, but when I got to my unit and they said, oh, yeah, by the way, we're slated to deploy in about 2 months. We're not really sure yet on the numbers. And I was like, well, put me on the list. I'll go. It was something along the lines of what happened with Phil. Oh, hey, look, there's your son. Oh, he just missed his little shout out. It was very much like no, this is where I have a purpose. This is what I'm here to do. This is I need to go there because that is how more of the people that I am here with and more of the people that I am here to serve are going to be able to come home. If I'm there to go and find the bad guys with the bombs before the bombs go off, at least in theory, and the one time I forget to duck, but at least that is where I am supposed to be. That is my purpose. That is how they're going to be able to come home. That's that's what I'm doing, and that's where I need to be. And that, I think, is what unites all of us up here. That even more so than the fact that, in defense of the stories told here, we also did not, I mean, like, I'm not giving candy to any kids. I actually still don't like groups of children walking up to me because I still get nervous. And no, like, I don't mind small children in ones and twos, but I actually do still get nervous around large groups of them because the chances are, for us, it was, if there's more than one of them, one of them may not have the intentions of just getting a piece of candy. As a matter of fact, like, if we would actually only carry candy in the trucks to throw it as far away as possible so that they would go running, because the one kid that didn't go running for the candy was the one that we needed to watch out for. And it's a horrible thing to think of. And, you know, I mean, I was still in my early 20s. Like, I have a graduate degree from an Ivy League university, and I had just been building buildings for a major firm, and all of a sudden I'm throwing candy to make sure that the infantry guys that I'm with aren't getting blown up by a kid who can't be older than 8. Like, mind-boggling. But that's, you know, that's showbiz,
Yeah.
as was so eloquently said by somebody else.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to be in the minority here. I like kids. I don't ever want kids. Nor can I have kids. Thanks, Uncle Sam. So I think it's each place has its own personality and its own kind of peculiarities, even in the same country. My brother, who is currently in Afghanistan on stop-loss orders, Google it.
Inside track.
Yeah, that's what it is. Still happening. Where he is and where he has been, because this is his second tour, was radically different than where I was. In Wardak, he was in Kandahar. That being said, I think I am a little biased, and I think that I'm also fortunate because these are a couple. The only face of our country, these so-called strategic corporals, these armed ambassadors. The more that there is the gap between the local population and the boots on the ground, that if that's reinforced, then of course we're going to lose the war, because if the war is among the population, then like strategically we can't win it if we don't know the people and if we hate them. And I don't blame my brothers and sisters on the stage here. I don't. But it was one of the primary failings that I saw in my own platoon, and I saw in myself when I made that shift from like, hey, it's actually kind of a good idea to have kids on patrol with you because the Talib and Hizb Islami aren't going to shoot at their own kids. That's one thing, and most of the time. But yeah, these lessons about the civilian population, I think we're going to.
As 1966 began, 2,344 Americans had died in Vietnam. Nearly 200,000 were stationed there, and more were on their way. Those soldiers would quickly discover that the war they were being asked to fight was not their father's war.
we tend to fight the next war in the same way we fought the last one. We are prisoners of our own experience. And many of the things that we learned that worked in World War II were not applicable to the war in Vietnam. We simply thought we'd go in with a sledgehammer and knock things down, clean them up, and it would be all over. It was a kind of an oversimplification of the problem, combined with our overconfidence that caused us, I think, to be arrogant. And it's very, very difficult to dispel ignorance if you retain arrogance.
So I think we got our clips flipped, because there was a clip also that I want to talk about this and the idea of fighting for the last generation's war, which I do think in some ways we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I want to give Drew the opportunity to talk a little bit about the civilian population. We had a clip also of some of the Vietnamese voices that were pretty prominent. You want to run it? Okay. Sorry. I don't know if I had it backwards. I made it pretty
Thứ bảy thì bắt đầu là lúc đó không bám làm gì địa phương, nó rồi Mỹ Càng nó bắt đi sinh, rồi bắt đầu người em ngủ ban đêm, rồi nó bắn cái trúng vô đạn mồ côi, cái rớt ngay tim chết luôn. Có người anh thứ sáu đó, người anh rể đó, người đó là cái giác điệp, cái dắt vô, rồi nó bẻ cổ chết. Bắn lọt đạn ngay nhà luôn, trúng người em. Bà mẹ ở nhà thì chỉ khóc thôi. Động viên đứa em út phải tham gia cách mạng tiếp.
I was brought up to believe that the communists were people who would destroy the family, destroy religion, and people who had no allegiance to our country but to international communism. My mother would describe them as no châu mặt ngựa, which means that these are people with the head of a water buffalo and the face of a horse, meaning that they were subhumans and they were brutal. But on the other hand, I thought they also include people like my sister Pham and a lot of my cousins. I couldn't quite reconcile the two images. But of the two, I think the other image was much stronger because I was so scared of them. I thought, these people must be really, really horrible people. That was the frame of mind I had when I started doing research into the communist movement.
Duong Von Mai was the daughter of an official in the South Vietnamese government and was now married to an American, David Elliott. Back in 1964, she had gone to work for the Rand Corporation in Saigon. The think tank had been commissioned by Robert McNamara to do a study of enemy prisoners to find out who are the Viet Cong and what makes them tick.
I remember my first interview. I was by myself. I was very young, and I was going to this pretty grim prison to interview this high-ranking cadre who had been captured. I went in thinking I'm going to meet this beast, you know, this guy with the head of a water buffalo and the face of a horse. He walked in and he was very surprised to see me, and just as surprised as I was to see him. Here was a man who had devoted all his life to fight for what he called a just cause, to free his country of foreign domination, to reunify the country under just government. So he really totally believed in it, to the point that he sacrificed his whole life to this cause. So I left, I was very impressed with him.
When the Rand report was presented to McNamara's top deputies at the Pentagon, describing the Viet Cong as a dedicated enemy that could only be defeated at enormous cost, one senior official said, "If what you say is true, we're fighting on the wrong side, the side that's going to lose this war."
Nice, huh? There's a lot going
That was
on
the
there.
Secretary of Defense said that.
Um,
Our chain of command leader, right guys? Civilian chain of command leader that our generals listened to. From Ford, he worked for Ford. That made him really qualified to be the Secretary of Defense. Robert McNamara.
So,
And I'll never forget. Or forget. I'm sorry, short time.
yep, a lot going on in the clip, but
She was great.
the point being, yeah, that there were a lot of Vietnamese voices, civilian, military, et cetera, a perspective that maybe we don't necessarily hear, and Drew has a unique window into to that side of things. So,
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, one of the primary failures of our military enterprise, but also our international enterprise. Because we do have this, there's this question of exceptionalism in the film, but I think that when it's applied to Vietnamese, it's very much a matter of that individual projecting kind of his own conception of it onto Vietnam after the war. That being said, we rarely think about the people that upon whom we make war, even though we're allies with the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, even though we're allies with the Republic of Iraq. We don't really look at them. We don't think of them when, you know, you're on the radio with your JFO, so you can drop a JDAM on some Kalats, which are Afghan houses, right? But if I can give you a window, at least some kind of shred of an empathic imagination, when I watch this as a child of a woman who survived all of the bombing campaigns on Pham and the surrounding areas, and I hear airmen, even airmen and generals who are somewhat repentant, when I hear them talk about it, when I hear even a POW who has suffered immensely cheer when bombs are dropping, I hate them. Can you imagine that? Like, if you had to sit in a room with someone who hated you, and for a real reason, I mean, you have to consider, I don't know how much ordnance was dropped in Iraq, I don't know, or Afghanistan, but it was a massive amount, especially during the invasion phases. I had to sit in a sitting room with a fellow shadow governor, and have tea with them, and you know, that's hard. That's really difficult to do, to have to face that. So I think the challenge moving forward, like, has to keep that human element in mind. It has to get away from the metrics-based way of this mechanistic way of going about war. And I mean ends up. I'm sure you can speak to it. That's a large reason why that counterinsurgency strategy failed.
Hello. Hanoi Hannah. Some of you young people will never know that name, so I'll introduce her. Hanoi Hannah was our propaganda in this. She was the lady who came on the radio or the microphones throughout the boonies where we were. And she would tell us. So I'm going to parallel what he said and what I felt. Soldiers of the 4th Battalion, brothers that are fighting us, why are you fighting us here? We are you. Do you know what was happening in 1960s in the United States of America? From the East Coast to the West Coast? Do you know of the riots and the unfairness that you are dealing with? Drop your weapons and walk north on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, when we're in the boonies, we're using machetes to chop our way through. All of a sudden, on a tree, you see a letter saying basically the same thing. Black men, why are you here? What are you here for? That question would only malinger in my mind again, because this is my comrade. This is who I'm here with and for. We were too young, as he just said. I was 18 years old. He was 19. But we all right here volunteered. That's ironic to me. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mooney. Okay. So, yeah, okay. But what I'm trying...
I wasn't the only one in Vietnam that was drafted. I just want to make that perfectly clear. Even though the documentaries didn't kind of say that. I was the only guy drafted in Vietnam.
Okay, I have to let I got this wrong.
Thank you very much.
But I just wanted you to understand how propaganda is used. And how deep, like he was just saying, how deep of a thought we can go into out there in them fields. This was very puzzling even to me today and in the wars that we're still fighting today. And I have many questions about what just happened that we all saw on the same newscasting about 4 of our seriously trained young men that died. It's the same thing. Who are we trying to figure out what truly happened to? Was it just Mr. Johnson, or did we know what happened to the other 3 special forcemen? These are things that we here in America have got to get together. So as you understand these 3 different wars that you're going to see, well, you got 2 up there, Vietnam and just Afghanistan. Oh, excuse me, and what?
Europe.
And home. Don't forget that. And home. That's all I wanted to say.
I think that's a good note. I'm going to add something real quick. We want to give the audience a chance to ask questions, but go for it.
I just wanted to say, anybody who finds themselves in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, visit the War Remnants Museum. It is a phenomenal study of the propaganda that surfaced during that period. It's just like 5 or 6 floors from both sides, and it's all the way from the French through the French, the U.S., the North Vietnamese. When I was there last year in Vietnam, I actually was there with a Habitat for Humanity veterans build, where a group of veterans goes out and from different combat theaters and builds, and we actually built a home for a North Vietnamese veteran, and he was like the sweetest guy like ever, and his family, and his son suffers disabilities from Agent Orange related learning disabilities and so forth, and it's just an incredible experience. But I strongly recommend the War Remnants Museum just to get a grasp of that propaganda that you're talking about and understanding what the people did go through. And I don't know, actually one of the things that I did say there when I was there is I can't even imagine doing this in Iraq or Afghanistan. And one of the Vietnam vets turned to me and said, he was like, do you know how long it's taken me to be able to do this and go to something like this, and how long it's taken us to get here? He was like, I don't know if you'll be able to see it in your lifetime because your wars are still going on. So, like, is this going to be able to happen in your lifetime? Are you going to be able to go to a War Remnants Museum in Kabul or in Baghdad? And I was like, yeah, do I really want to go back to Baghdad? Ugh. So...
No thanks.
Yeah, so who knows?
Question?
Yeah, we're gonna get to the audience questions. Yeah.
First of all, I would like to say thank you for your...
Dan, you want to help out here?
I'm good. I'll give you a quick break.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for your service. You did what you did. No one has the right to judge you. No one has the right to say anything negative about you. And Mark Twain, the writer Mark Twain, is famous for many things, but the thing that I always remember about him was, he said, loyalty to your nation always, loyalty to a government when it deserves it.
Yeah.
So my question is, did the U.S. government, remember Congress never declared Vietnam a war, right? Did the U.S. government ever tell you, either before you left America to go to Vietnam or to go to Afghanistan, or once you got there, why you were there?
No. No.
I'll answer. Well, I was under the impression all along, and I learned it was
We killed them all.
Was what was also indicated in earlier parts of this Ken Burns series, the domino effect.
Yeah.
There was an intense fear of communism in our country, McCarthy era, whatever. I was a little baby at that time, but there was a very large form of anti-communist issues that were always coming up. So I was really under the belief that I was preventing communism from spreading. I'm very proud of my service. There are issues that I had to go through to be able to deal with all of that stuff. I'm very honored to have served and to be among others who have served. It's an incredible feeling. It's a hard thing to understand, the brother and sisterhood that exists among veterans, no matter what side of the fence we were on, before or after, if we changed our mind, however, since. Serving a country, as Lon was saying, you come back with a certain kind of feeling that you've done something to help everybody else who's here. Now, that's what I was doing, and I honor that. I don't know the big picture. I do know that it wasn't long afterwards that Nixon went over to China, and then we were doing business with China, a communist country. So that's a little confusing. We're fighting them, and they were supporting the North Vietnamese, and then we were going to do business with them. But I did understand that our capitalist system is such that if you do business with another country, there's less of a chance of having a war, because then you'll destroy the economy on either side. So that little factor of economics that I barely understand and never really studied, it makes sense. It made sense to me. So, does that answer?
I don't think any war that when you're drafted or when you volunteer, people tell you why you're going to war. You're 19 years old. You're young. You're going to war, and they can give you gobbledygook. Once you're there for each other. We're there to make sure that we all get out of this fucking situation alive.
That's right.
Everybody
We've said that so many times.
Yes, that's what we're fighting for. And as far as later on, that communism, yes, but that was proven to be bullshit later. Not only in the documentary, unfortunately. I mean, I'm not trying to I'm proud of Phil for doing it, he had a good reason. But none of us, I don't think any veteran here, raise your hands if you were told, were you told what you were going to, were you told what you were going to war, what you were going for?
Like communism, man.
Yeah, communism. Right. And how long did it take you to figure out it wasn't communism?
Oh, a hard struggle.
I appreciate
So-
that.
Welcome to a very different place.
So, I think our generation.
But this gentleman has something to say. Sorry.
Yeah, 1966, I grew up 15 miles north of Worcester, Massachusetts. I'd been out of college, high school for a year. There's a lot to it. But a good friend who'd been going to Antioch College in Ohio, it's like the Berkeley of the Midwest. And he introduced me the summer of '66, we were both working in the same factory where I had that white collar job, to a guy named Abby Hoffman, who ran the snick shop in Worcester. So I spent the summer of '66 wondering if I was going to get drafted, dealing with some medical issues that could keep me out or not, depending on whether I had an operation. And I knew damn well, by the end of '66, that war was bullshit. There was an article in Ramparts magazine. I mentioned that. You people maybe know what I'm talking about. It was a very slick magazine. You know, a bombshell in every issue. We knew from reading that and believing what the sources said that the Tonkin Gulf incident was total crap. We knew it. But there were 35,000 guys a month.
Right.
And because of an operation I had to have on an undescended testicle, all right? I was 4F, tried to join the Air Force, and found out that I had a condition that Hitler had that prevented me from having any service. What the fuck do you do with that? Well, and finding out that because of it, it was more prone to cancer and injury after playing 4 years of football. Thanks. Well, I opted to have the operation so that I was normal and so that I was whole and so that I didn't have this, what do you tell people if that's what happened and you couldn't fight or wouldn't fight? Well, the Navy only takes volunteers, the Air Force and the Coast Guard. So I went to the Navy and they let me join. So there I am fighting a war that I knew was crap. But my grandfather was in the Black Watch. My father was on the Okinawa. And I believe in this country. So I joined. And I'm very, very, very proud of what I did. I kept pilots in the air who were flying off of carriers and who were supporting the SEALs and the Swift boats out of Ventura on top. And the more that I look back on all of this, and I didn't realize I was a veteran, I walked away from the whole damn thing when I got back in '71. But and theater, I got a degree in movement for theater in 1975. The first time I ever heard the words "thank you for your service," I met a young guy, probably most people here know, named Paul Rykoff. April 14th, 2004, we've both been invited to meet Senator Kerry when he came around looking for votes. That morning, the Secret Service guy checked me out with a wand, looked at my bag and said, "Thank you," as he's looking at my bag and my feet, and I said, "For what?" He's checking out my bag. He said, "Thank you for your service." On April 14th, 2004. First time I ever heard those words. On the way coming back to the city, Paul drove me back there and kicked my ass to join the VA. He said, "You get your health care from the VA?" I said, "No, fuck it." I walked away from that when I went back to college to grow my hair and play around in theater. But I did. Manhattan VA on 23rd Street has saved my life twice in the last 10 years. So I'm still trying to balance, like you all, all of this. But it put me and put all of us, I believe, in a crucible of consciousness. Crucible of conscience. If you had one, you know, if you were open enough to pay attention to it. The Navy made it pretty plain to us. I became an engine mechanic and then an inspector and then a teacher of inspectors of aircraft. And, but the Navy only takes the top 10% of anybody who takes the ASVAB test. They drilled that into us. You guys are the cream of the cream. Pay attention, do a good job. I finally figured out that what my job was keeping pilots in the air. That's it. And some of them didn't come back. Some of my was. Like all of them. But it's taken me the last 13 years since I met Paul to try and resolve what the hell that was all about. I put it down. 33 years. Thank you.
Welcome home. Welcome home.
To answer that one question that I learned, I don't need all that. I'm just going to tell her what it was. I had the understanding that we were over there for police action. We were supposed to be policing Vietnam, South Vietnam, not engaging. It was told up to us that we can't fire upon anybody unless fired upon. So we were only really there, as they told us, for police action. Blew my mind. Blew my mind.
Isn't that the same rules of engagement in Afghanistan and
Yes,
Iraq?
it is.
You can't fire until you're fired upon.
Yes, it is.
How's that for a fucking army? Okay?
I mean,
Come
we
on.
didn't follow the
We would return friendly fire. That's what we would do. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. You have the mic.
Thank you for your show. I don't think this is working. And thank you for speaking with us. I wanted to ask you, I thought what was unique about the Vietnam War was that what you encountered when you came home was a reaction of people, the anti-war people that you referenced. They were so hostile to soldiers. And I'm curious to know what you felt, if you experienced it yourself or your friends, or you saw your friends experiencing it. And specifically, Tom, you said that you clearly have maintained hostility towards McNamara. In some ways, I feel like you relate to the people who were trying to confront the soldiers coming home.
I was, when I first came home, I lived in a very blue-collar neighborhood, and I was welcomed home, but I was totally, I couldn't adjust back to civilian life, like my Navy friend here. So I had to go visit a gentleman I spent 18 months in the military with in Vietnam, from Philadelphia, to try to reacclimate myself to civilian life. So my neighborhood was all blue collar, firemen and cops, so no one really gave me a lot of grief. And then once you're back, you're out of uniform. Sure, in Oakland it was a little weird when I was going to get a plane home, and at Kennedy Airport it was a little odd, and some people looked at me like, where the fuck are you? But it was still not, they weren't spitting on us yet. But then, as I got back into college, got back into school, I could sense the hostility. So I did not go around telling everyone I was a Vietnam veteran, okay? And there were incidents, and I sometimes, to this day, I'm sorry that I didn't confront someone when they started talking about it, and I was in the room. Then, of course, I went back into the theater and music business, and nobody is a veteran. So then when the shit hit the fan, I sympathized with all the veterans that were going through something that I didn't experience. But I wasn't welcome home. I wasn't like a hero, and nobody except people on my block could give a fuck. So there's this whole sense of, does anybody know where I was? Does anybody know what we went through? Does anybody give a flying fuck? No. That starts the anger and the bitterness, right? And in college, I had an incident with a professor. This is when I was getting a little angry. Had the audacity to say that some of these guys coming back not knowing I was a veteran from war wanted 3 credits for their combats for being in a foreign country, whereas someone who was in England for a class could get 3 credits. But he was saying that I, not knowing it was I, couldn't get 3 lousy fucking credits for my Vietnam service. And that's when I had a bit of a moment in Hunter College with a professor. And he realized as I was freaking out that I might have been a veteran. We were not treated well at all. And we kind of, no, you are?
I have a different reaction to what you're saying.
Okay.
I think that a lot of people were very curious about what happened, I think they were very afraid to talk about it with you, because I remember conservative people acting like assholes, left-wing people acting like assholes, everybody acting like assholes, frankly. And that's the experience I recall from 1971, 72. The most profound thing I remember that I experienced in, not too far away from here, 28th Street, I went into one of those first rap groups that ever occurred. And the theme of it was, how did John Wayne affect you as a man? And every single guy there had something to say about that, let me tell you. Everybody. And the indifference I felt to everybody around. Everybody. Because remember, Richard Nixon was the president. Richard Nixon cut the GI Bill. People forget that. So when people say, thank you for your service, welcome home, I remember the welcome home when I had friends who couldn't go to school because they couldn't afford to separate from their families and go to school on a GI Bill. And thank God it was our fighting for it, us who went through that experience 50 years ago, that made it easier for these young guys to get a decent GI Bill. And I'm proud that you did that. Okay? I'm proud that you did that. That all the people were reacting negatively to us, because I don't personally remember that. I don't remember people spitting. Who's going to spit on somebody who has a CID on? I mean, really, you got to be nuts to do something like that. So, like, you know, everybody has a different strokes for different folks, kind of things that might do that.
Yeah. Well, I understand from, I call him Doctor, who brought me home in a way, too, in his book, Bringing It All Back Home. And look at the home that I came to in 1968. It was called Bedford-Stuyvesant. They didn't ask no questions. Only thing my siblings and my parents did was tell me that I changed. They wouldn't, like you did say something that had struck a nerve. They were very psychic of me. I suffer from PTSD. And basically all that is wounds that you don't see. But bringing everything back home, he's right. We didn't have too much to say, did we? No, we didn't, unless a nerve was stricken. So for me bringing it back home, I was very quiet, like you said. No military, nothing. They didn't find out that I was mentally suffering from depression or anything else till 25 years later, 1992. So it's very difficult when we say when we came home from Vietnam. Vietnam was a very odd war. Police action, excuse me. And the reason for that being is because of the way they sent us and brought us back home. Very few of us went over with a whole unit. We went over individually. 2 or 3 of us might have known each other in the whole plane flight over. So in the same way we came back home when we derode, started with ETS. We were basically going that plane by ourselves almost. Nobody in my whole battalion came home with me. Nobody. So I came home basically what? Alone. Get it? And that's because of the year that I went. But that's the way Vietnam veterans, or let's say soldiers, became veterans once they got home. That's how they came home, by themselves. And that's the way they went, by themselves.
Isolation.
Yes, yeah, we were at that kind of.
I think what's actually interesting, and I don't know if Drew, I don't know, Drew, what years did you go?
10 to 11.
Oh, okay, that's later than I did.
Late war, I thought.
Late war. Yeah.
Mid-war.
Wrap it up. It's actually really interesting because it even changed based on when when we would go. My ex-husband was infantry, 82nd Airborne Infantry, and we both went early in both wars. And when he got back, it was early in the Iraq War, and most of the country was still very angry that we had gone into Iraq. I mean, hell, I was still angry that we had gone into Iraq. And I was still in Afghanistan, and he had just gotten back from Iraq, and I remember him telling me he had just gotten home and he went to go visit his grandparents, and so he had put on his uniform and he stopped in like a gas station, like little shop, to pick something up for his grandmother, and somebody had spit on him in uniform in the gas station like shop in uniform, and he was like, I didn't think that this was happening anymore. But it was like still just that emotional response, and like it was, but it's that emotion of and I think it was, what's interesting is that it didn't happen until a little bit later in kind of the Vietnam War, when the tide started to turn, but it happened so early in the Iraq War. And now it's kind of like everybody kind of feels bad because we can't get the hell out of there, that they just kind of feel bad, like, oh my God, we kind of just end. And I mean, I just am at the point where, I mean, people are still surprised because they're like, they still don't expect women to be veterans anyway, so it doesn't really matter anyway. I walk into the VA and I still get, unless I recognize the security guard, they're still like, oh, who are you there to see? So it really doesn't matter.
I know you're running out of time here, but I have one question concerning the documentary.
I don't know if this will reach you.
My name is Kevin Gill. I am a Vietnam veteran. Please. And everything else, 2007. So I didn't miss out on any parties along the way. My concern is, well, first with a statement, preface with a statement. I had the privilege to attend a screening, a film clip screening with Ken Burns and Lynn Novick at CBS Radio. And I want to address a question after I make this statement. Ken introduced himself, and he said, I don't know if it was his intent with the documentary or a result. And what he tried to achieve was, and this word got my attention, reconciliation. And I said, wow. And he went on, he said, we had questions after the film screening. So I had about a 15-minute conversation with Lynn. And I asked, I hope you don't mind my back.
No, they're good.
And I said, I have to ask you something that Ken mentioned right up front. And he said, he used the word reconciliation. And she said, well, please watch all the episodes, and you'll see that we had discussion with South Vietnamese soldiers and North Vietnamese soldiers. And I told her about one of my experiences, and I said, this is that word. I said, I experienced genocide in Rwanda when 1.5 million people were basically slaughtered. I was on the 2nd Air Force jet to land in Kigali Airport. And it was always been hard for me to get through this. 900 people murdered at the airport fleeing the machete. And they were digging a mass grave at the end of the runway. And I told them, well, you can find about another 900 or 1,000 out in the fields or all over the place. So I told Lynn this, and I said, that's why I'm concerned about this word, and how will the public and veterans, what will their reaction be? Is, as I said, Ken's intention was, or maybe not his intent, but a result of how people would take the documentary, particularly Vietnam veterans. And there's a lot of Vietnam vets that I know that they started out with an attitude against Ken Burns, and I think it's unfair. I think Ken and Lynn did an excellent job, a lot of hard work in 10 years to put that together. And I hope there's a lot of goodness come out of it. And that's what I said to Lynn. I said, I see a lot of hope for this. So, Drew, I'm sorry to put you on the hot seat here, but I would like to know, get your feedback to what I just said, from your perspective.
All right, so I think I'm one of the few of my peers that I know of that don't hate the enemy. I never hated the enemy. The Dalib or Hezbi Islami Arakani, Shabaka, I didn't hate any of them. Because everyone thinks they're doing the right thing. My mom's side of the family, they thought they were doing the right thing when they sent all their sons south. My dad's side of the family, they thought they were doing the right thing to preserve some kind of really abstract sense of freedom. But I also harbor a lot of resentment, as I said, towards the states, which is ironic because I served in uniform. My brother served in uniform. I will say this. I would. And the only time I cried, I was close to crying throughout the documentary. The only time I cried was at the very beginning when Bako quoted the American Declaration of Independence. And I would rather have not been born and our country fulfill the promise in that. Like if only we had just kind of come to our senses in that moment. I would rather Vietnam be a free and prosperous country after 47, no, 54. Sorry, my brain's not working, it's late. Than to have been born, because, the hate, the resentment, it's not worth it. None of it's worth it. So that's what I have to say about that.
You got time for one more question?
How you doing? I just want to thank my brothers and sisters for your service. I served 32 years, from 1980 to 2012, but I was smart. I did 29 Air Force, 3 Army, so I had a brain. I spent my whole career my whole 32 years in combat support and logistics. I did supply for the Army and the Air Forces, but I spent 25 years of my 29 with the Air Force in air transportation, loading, unloading C-140. First I got deployed to Afghanistan. I came back home for 6 months. Before I left Afghanistan, they already scheduled me to go to Iraq. And the biggest thing I got about going to both countries was the fact is that me and Afghanis, when I went to Saudi Arabia in 97, Saudis, Qatar in 04, I've been to the Persian Gulf like 4 times. The biggest satisfaction I got about it is that we would sit down and eat we talk over a slice of pizza. Or, one of the other contractors, KFC, 3-piece chicken, we're having a casual conversation. But one of the biggest things I got about it is that they would tell me, we heard a whole lot about bad things about you Americans. And we realized, just like over here, it was stereotypes. And I told them we heard a whole lot of bad things about you guys. And we realized it was stereotypes. And one of the biggest satisfactions I got out of that is that all the different Arab countries, the 4 Arab countries that I went to, all the different sects, in Islam, is the fact is that they said, you're no different than us. You just want to have peace and quiet and, raise your family and not have to avert to war.
you know, and you know, I got, it's so funny when my sister over there said what happened to her ex once he got back. I had an Iraqi freedom hat on after I got back from Qatar in September 04, October 04 was my first experience of some individual on the #1 train called me a baby killer, and then he ran to the other car because he knew my reaction was going to be. At that time, maybe my reaction would have been less lethal because I wasn't properly diagnosed with PTSD at that time. You know, I mean, you're talking about 32 years, so there's a whole lot of different, in peacetime and in wartime, a whole lot of things that affected me, you know, negatively. You know, positively, of course, there was more than that, but negatively, those are the situations that hang with you the worst, the longest, forever. You know, and, you know, I was out there, you know, for my troops first, and to help out Iraq and Afghanistan after the fact. You know what I mean? But we was out there for each other. You know, war makes you, believe it or not, you know, war makes you sane to realize how much nonsense we get bent up out of shape here in the U.S. I mean, it's just the most trivial, dumbest things. There's more important things going on in other parts of the world that they have unsecure democracy, unsecure freedom. I mean, okay, you know, like for example, put the phone down and drive. You know what I mean? There's more important things going on around the world. But, you know, I'm 4th generation military. My brother served in Vietnam with the 82nd Airborne. My dad served in World War II. My grandfather served in World War I. And my brother came back severely traumatized. He came back and he self-medicated with drugs. He got detoxed and changed the self-medication to alcohol. He passed away when he was just 27. He got back from Vietnam November '69, and his body was just torn up from psychologically and physically. He was just torn up from the war. And you know, but I've educated myself about what you guys went through. I had a Vietnam veteran in the Air Force educate me. He was stationed at Tan Son Nhut, okay, Air Base, and he told me if what we heard about Afghanistan or Iraq it's pretty replica to Vietnam, where you won't have to go off the base to be traumatized. And you know, as far as bombings, I've been through too many to count. Thank you.
I think we're out of time, unfortunately. I know there's a bar gathering where hopefully everyone can, or whoever wants to join can talk a little bit more about this. But I just want to thank our panelists. Encourage everyone to think a little bit about what, you know, this documentary is going to look like when they make it in 40 years about Iraq and Afghanistan, and you know how the path of history goes from one generation to the next, because we all need to learn from each other. Yeah.
Hanoi Hannah played great music. You forgot to tell you that part. She played rock and roll, guys. Remember? It was fucking great.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.
I like this.